My activism came in late 70s and early 80s when I helped set up the Women's Artists Library. And that is now under the World Collections at Goldsmiths where I work. So at least there's some sustainability for research, and because it's a fantastic archive and you have to think about those things in terms of legacies, I think. Otherwise, sometimes we will try and reinvent the wheel. And I promise not to pace around. Okay, so in 1987, which is why I've got this slide up, Women and Craft was published by the then Virago Press. And Sue Richardson was one of the co-editors and contributed an interview with Gay Richardson called Crocheted Strategies, a new audience for women's work. Well, it was new then, it's late now. And the book was an outcome of Feminist Artist News, 1981, the Craft issue, which some of us contributed to, which raised a number of questions about the relative status of the crafts and the value-ridden, debates that came from women's assigned status as other than artist. Now, the curator of this particular exhibition, Alexandra Colley, stated, quote, Sue Richardson's homemade objects explore domesticity, femininity, and their mutual implications from a distinctly feminist point of view. The exhibition, in fact, which was called Burnt Breakfast and Other Works, included the iconic Burnt Breakfast, in which the so-called womanly skill of crochet is used against the grain to express in a humorous manner, but perhaps rather ideologically banner-like, a growing dissatisfaction between and against patriarchal gender roles, and also to challenge what we've heard earlier, these issues about the division between art and crafts. If I can find the iconic Burnt Breakfast, it would be good to put it up now. I think this is a forerunner of Sarah Lucas's work, actually, but not always acknowledged. Okay, so that is the iconic Burnt Breakfast. It also has a copy of the Sunday Times, which is also crocheted, but not in the image. The important thing about this, really, is that for 40 years, all this work was kept in a bag, in a black bin liner in Sue Richardson's loft, before it was taken out and exhibited in the Constance Howard, the Textile Gallery in Deptford Town Hall last year. I know there's a number of ex-Goldsmiths colleagues and students, so it's very nice that we're here to say that's still going, and also under the auspices of the World Collection in the library. So that's saved for in perpetuity as well. Okay, now this is where the biographical bit comes in, because that's always quite important, it seems to me, to place these things in some kind of historical context. So I was a student and a painting student at that in the early 70s, when there were many arguments and anxieties about art. Now, the desire to retrieve what might be called women's work from neglect and the so-called female category to which it was usually assigned profoundly affected my thinking and making for the next decade. You've got to remember I read Germaine Gray as the female eunuch when I was 17. Armed with my hard copy of Art and Sexual Politics, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, and a subscription to Spare Rib, I now play the slideshow. And I'm delighted to say all the copies of Spare Rib are now kept at the University of Sussex in their library archives, which is incredibly important because, again, that's a research resource. So the problematic position of what may be called women's traditional crafts enabled not only some kind of distinction from an aesthetics of the purely visual, but also provided a strategy for mobilizing. Many of you will understand, we've already heard Sarah talk about embroidery and stitch, as a weapon of resistance against some kind of inculcated feminine idea. Now, this sort of double strategy, if you like, had clear implications for the future, particularly feminist textile practices that desired and demanded, I would say, public recognition via exhibitions and writing, and Penina's in the audience, and she's done a great amount of work ensuring that that should be the case. And on the one hand, collage or montage in the form of piecing and patching, and on the other, certain kinds of scripto-visual or mixed media techniques could be adapted and combined to present the conditions and causes of what might be called women's oppression, instead of simply reproducing its appearances. And here, for many of us, textiles were transformed into a feminist coup de grace in this brave new world of defying well-worn out and reduced hierarchies. Now, there were some dissonant voices even at that time, Michelle Barrett for one, who argued that the recovery and elevation of a collective gathering of women's traditional arts, for example, Judy Chicago, to the status of art objects hung in a gallery was not necessarily feminist art, and that's a question we should think about. On the other hand, feminism, as espoused by Rosalind Coward in her work dating from the early 80s, was an alignment of political interests and not a shared feminine experience. Feminist art in these different contestations and views was not the same as any art which emphasized what could be called some kind of a collective experience. Now, even if these cautionary tales voiced a political unease at conflating the revival of crafts within feminist politics, within an expanded field which we've often cited of practices and methodologies, it still provided an unusually productive and critical space for a post-60s generation of women art school graduates. Now, I've often written, many of you will be bored to tears with this, but textiles, both as a material set of practices and a fluid set of mobile sewings, did become available for application and discourse in many different ways. Now, whether this was, I've just got to fly on a bit here, whether it's an art of personal negotiation, as in Miriam Shapiro's Feminages, or as a critique of patriarchal society, some would argue problematically in Judy Chicago's Dinner Party, or as an examination of domesticity in the sexual division of labour, for example, Feministo and Woman House, and this is what these early slides refer to. Certainly, this whole combination of stitch, embroidery, quilting, patching were used to explore both the personal and the political, craft and class, piecework and global industrialisation. Now, the sexual division of labour, as well as craft and class, were just some aspects of women's work in the late 1970s, particularly in this country and in London. It's a very metropolitan-based debate. Now, I saw issues social strategies by women artists at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London in 1980, the exhibition curated by the great Lucy Lippard. There was Fan. Okay. The exhibition, oh yes, I've said that. Phoenix, which is what this is, a cooperative travelling installation made by Sue Richardson, Monica Ross and Kate Walker, was represented in this particular exhibition. Each of these artists had all been part of Feministo, an earlier postal event. And in issues they explored something of the nurturant kitchen, or what was described as the other side of the blanket, which dates from 1977, or iconically conjured as a portrait of an artist as a young housewife, as a citation against James Joyce. Kate Walker's pink and blue knitted mat maintained the stitched apology, heart, not art, homemade, I'm afraid. Phoenix's combination of fried eggs, breast motifs, crocheted breakfasts, and pregnant cushions might seem cliched, but they are also, I would suggest, exceedingly funny. When Feministo was shown, it was derided for its use of textile work to challenge the art system. Rosika Parker, the late Rosika Parker, ever alert, noted that in one location, a sign reading, "Not suitable for children," was hung on the door before you entered, seeing portrait of an artist as a housewife, and that's taken from Spare Rib 7, 1977. Similar themes had been inspired directly by the Woman House project created by Judy Chicago, Miriam Shapiro, and students from a feminist art program at the Californian Institute of the Arts in 1972. Lucy Lippard had already written about household images in art, and the phenomena she describes perhaps best sums up the impact of the women's movement on art-making processes that deployed all kinds of stitching, sewing, weaving at that time. Now, a second work perhaps had a much greater impact on how, this is the version of the dinner party, had an even greater impact on what I was thinking about at the time throughout the 80s. Margaret Harrison's collage paintings, and I was very intimidated before I first met her, so I do sympathise with that. And in the end, you go down the pub and it's all right. Margaret's collage paintings and documentation pieces did indeed focus on women and work, craft and class. The visual core of craft work, which is an image here, consisted of 3 versions of each craft piece. The actual lace doily, a painting of it, and a photograph, the items of which belonged to her mother-in-law. They traced, the work did, the de-skilling process of working class women since industrialisation by moving from a handmade patchwork to a cheap doily made in the factory by working women and sold back to them. Now, it seemed to me that both Margaret Harrison's craft work and home workers from 1975, which I saw in the South London Gallery at that time, were seminal works of the period. And if you want to really trace that back, do look at Pollock and Parker's Framing Feminism, Art and the Women's Movement, 1970 to 1985, which was published by Pandora's Press. Okay, so let me stress that such investigations into ideas of women experience within the home and at work are echoed in much feminist writing interested in these questions as a source of literary and critical metaphor, and in critiques of philosophy and science. Such discourses revolve around the re-evaluation of experience and its relation to constructed knowledge. Last year we ran this seminar at Goldsmiths between Take Your Spare Spectacles Off, Anthropology, Computing, Sociology, and the University of Warwick. And we asked Katie King to come and talk about some of these questions in relation to the constructions of knowledge. She described mapping emergent forms of knowledge in terms of gender and in terms of what could be called knotting in common. Quote, knowledge work, that is to say, work cultures centering knowledge and information systems and technologies as economies themselves become new forces in different kinds of valuing economics. Culture crafts, publics and industries or public culture sewn up with economic development amid shifts in cultural value, all display in various proportions new and old ways of thinking about technology and value. This is taken from her network reenactment stories, transdisciplinary knowledge, from the Duke University Press in 2011. Now, Katie King made a very important point that within different knowledge worlds that join up in different communities of practice, and Sarah's given us a very fine example of that question of activism, is not a general or a universal knowledge that everyone should share, but they do come together like knots. They join in a new knowledge world journey, dynamically interconnected. And this offers a range of possible interactive or indeed playful contexts, but situated in different levels of scoping and scaling and in different temporalities. Now, with a particular focus on the handicraft techniques that have been described here, many of you will know Rosika Parker's book, The Subversive Stitch from 1984, where she begins to argue how it became indelibly associated with stereotypes of femininity and sort of ideas of expected behaviour. And often in that book you'll find descriptions of the mocking tone of derision from men towards embroidery in the 18th century, including Ruskin, actually, just to make that point. For women to claim embroidery as a creative activity was often sneered at, and as Parker noted at the time, quote, when women had learnt not to claim creative merit for embroidery but to assert, it became not for a labour of love, but one in which many occupations could be consumed, not to just fill a woman's day. Now, Parker had articulated two paradoxical issues in her book. On the one hand, it being a marker of femininity, on the other as a weapon of resistance, enabling women in particular to actively produce things in the world, transforming their knowledge systems and experiences and materials into meaningful expressions, objects, or to carve out this place for reflective thought and indeed self-expression. The process of creativity, as Parker noted, the finding of form for thought, have a transformative impact on the sense of self. Now that's an inward thing. Perhaps Sarah might say it has an outward trajectory. So the public, the personal, are simply porous membranes of exchange. And similarly, in her conclusion, to her study, The Culture of Knitting, Turney from 2009, had noted that knitting offers, quote, a creative means of confidence in one's own ability to do, as well as occupying a space in which one can just be. The process of knitting is rewarding, she suggests, because something both pleasing and useful is produced, and for some because it represents an ethical and a political choice to make some clothing oneself rather than purchase it from a clothing factory, and as we have seen in relation to that fire and many people dying, mostly women in the factory in Bangladesh, very poorly paid workers in the most appalling political and economic conditions. So what explains the activity and the rise of crafting linked to creativity, community and activism now? So part of the explanation appears that crafting is now a movement with appealing values that, as Sarah has really well articulated, people want to be really part of. And David Gauntlet, and I recommend this actually, presents also such a case in Making is Connecting, the social menu of creativity from DIY and knitting to the infamous YouTube and Web 2.0 technology. And having worked for the last 7 years with students in art and technology, you would be amazed at their absolute commitment to different kinds of craft production at the very height of being amazing programmers. So in this particular book, Gauntlet traces a continuum of crafts practice through to the digital age of blogging, social networks, making videos from YouTube, etc. And he goes on to argue that engaging with such technologies is an example of everyday creativity that helps bring people together to make and innovate. Very different to the post-war scenario here of make, do and mend. Nothing dutiful about it. This is a whole other scenario. 3 definitions or 3 definitive motivations are outlined for making and everyday creativity. 1, pleasure and enhanced self as a creative agent. 2, feeling alive in the world through the ability to do things as an active participant, engaged in dialogue with a community which you construct, not necessarily physically, but in terms of globalization and social media. And 3, recognition, value, a different kind of idea of value, by like-minded people. Indeed, crafters interviewed for Handmade Nation in this particular book support this idea of being an active participant, engaged in dialogue with a community. Homemade things were special because they carry this notion, quote, of the authentic and the personal, liking creativity because they've been put off by doing art because of the education system, which had framed it as being too serious, too intellectual, and too analytical. Because when people started to find websites, get crafty, they felt inspired to do whatever they wanted. I realized I had found my people, said one, Kirsty Pettersson, that's quoted here, but we didn't need to use that because we had our own Sarah here, which is even better. So the plethora of blogs and widespread interest in what might be called indie crafting is an example of this kind of rejuvenation. Labelled as independent and widely used in the late 80s and 90s in the UK, I apologise about not knowing too much about the rest of Europe, but certainly what comes from the States usually filters down here quite quickly. Initially used as a label for popular music bands and certainly films, releasing their music without assistance from corporate record labels. So the term independent became synonymous with an increased idea of artistic control over every aspect of creative production. And this movement has been defined as possessing the qualities of credibility, an idea of freedom to promote work and control the promotion, and how a kind of open-mindedness, an idea to take creative risks. Now you can argue, and many people do, about this notion of democracy through this kind of capacity to have ideas about freedom, to take creative risks. We can argue about that. But certainly, indie crafters involved in handmaking, the results of which are then documented. Question is sustainability, archiving, content management, all the sort of stuff that libraries are trying to deal with becomes a huge issue. Once it disappears, it's gone. Well, it hasn't quite gone, actually, in the big cloud and the big data, but there are issues about what's saved and how that's organised. So the range of making moves from stereotypical handcraft practice of crocheting ideas of the granny square to hip-knitted iPad holders. The choice is yours. And the recent uptake, perhaps, in the traditional techniques of knitting, sewing, crocheting has seen a transition from the traditional domain into mainstream home magazines, newspaper profiles, television lifestyle programs, and online, speaking from a predominantly Western position of young, urban, and female. Independent crafters, indie crafters, are intent on spreading the message about the power of making, and attempt to define indie craft precisely as perhaps contradictory, though one of the strongest features is its online presence, the plethora of blogs, web forums, dedicated to the practices and discussion of indie craft. It arguably combines practices of handcraft making with new technologies. It could not exist without Web 2 technology. How long? How long?
15.
Far too long. I'll be done in about 5, and then you can all have tea. So, I just want to check. If I talk too fast, please slow me down. So in my contribution to this particular book, published in 2002, a change in craft practice and scholarship is leading to changes within what you might want to call contemporary craft theory, not just in terms of publications, but also in the use of blogs and podcast debates. Now, my chapter was called Loving Attention, an outburst of craft in contemporary art, where I argued that the definitions of DIY and independent crafting are linked by a remix, mashup, hash-up, of personal creativity and social activities. Superficially, they may look something like the 1970s craft movement, but in substance, maybe they're quite different. And if you check any of the current websites on craft, for example, and you've mentioned Betsy, then you might want to suggest that the current DIY ethos seems to or seeks to confront different ideas of mass market consumerism and the blandness of much corporate culture on the one hand, and on the other challenges preconceived notions of what gets shown and where as contemporary art. You're on top of the roof, you're not inside the space. Actually, Betsy is an alumnus of Goldsmith's sociology, and they didn't even remember that. So that's quite interesting. They don't even know what they've got. Okay. MA in Sociology, 2004. And my colleagues didn't know that. Not serious sociology, that's probably why. But Sian's here to argue that, so good. All right. So, DIY, or the do-it-yourself movement, encompasses at least 3 definitions, depending on whether you see yourself as producing extreme craft, a mix of craft masquerading as art and vice versa, or as a crafter, recognizing that no object can be produced without irony or involved in craftism, pursuing not just a crafty life, which means you're as crafty as a fox, but activating projects with a political agenda. Nonetheless, in the same anthology, there continues to be a very lively debate as to how contemporary crafting is informed by feminist discourses. Sort of touched on it earlier. And Katie King's idea about knowledge systems I referred to earlier. Now, on the one hand, Dennis Stevens, in that same anthology, argues that crafting is, quote, predominantly driven by the ideology of third-wave feminism. DIY craft comprises loosely connected groups of individuals with a general collective interest in reshaping, or at least a stand against, what they view as the inequalities of social and economic power under capitalism. He goes on to argue that the embracing of handcraft amongst the younger generation of women is a statement on the presumed role of domestic creativity, arguably rejected during second-wave feminism. I think that's a contentious point, but that's fine. Argument is all. He describes, this is Stevens again, independent of what is termed indie craft as emerging from, quote, a culture that does not seek professional validation within traditional methods, but which comes from a rather unintentional remeshing of the 70s principles and aesthetics, it used to be a dirty word, choosing to reinvent tradition as this remix, engaging with it through parody, satire, and nostalgic irony. Problematic. Now, on the other hand, Kirsty Robertson, who was a postdoc with me, holds the view that political and feminist actions of the new wave of contemporary crafters are often made without historical placement. In an analysis of the resurgence of knitting, for example, she finds that there is little mention of crafts-based political activisms which had occurred in some form from the suffragettes. Actually, when they were interned, you remember there was a very beautiful stitched handkerchief that was made by Emmeline Pankhurst. Through to the feminist movement of the 70s, a quote from Kirsty, "It is possible, in fact, to trace the history of the ebbs and flows through embroidered suffragette banners, back and much further to the weaving and unpicking of Penelope's cloth in a trail of activism, constantly broken, crossed over, and often erased. It is perhaps this lack of acknowledgement of a connection to past craft-based activism and feminist history that is seen by Robertson as a significant flaw by crafters, but notes that some of the practice can be seen as part of a feminist and contemporary discourse. And so, similar to Stephen's suggestion that craft is tied up to a woman's place within the domestic sphere, Robertson also argues that handcrafting has become a statement on different kinds of domestic roles and rethinking an assertion that one held so dear from the 70s, that the personal is indeed political. This time around, Kirsty argues, women do choose to knit, do choose to crochet, and do choose to stitch, forming this community and friendship through this online communication network, which removes the practice from what might have been thought once as a form of isolation. And so Robertson concludes that the resurgence of feminine knitting, feminine in scare marks, could be more closely intertwined with the changing ideas of the masculine economy, linked to global capitalism and a drive towards developing craft brands that operate within existing creative industry models, whilst at the same time here the so-called British textile industry has shrunk by 40% between 1994 and 2004. So, to wrap. Now the question here. Is craft, fibre, textile, whatever is in a name, a viable mode for feminist political action? Is the term feminism expanded to include, quote, a practice as well as a politics and a strong intellectual movement? This is taken from Anne Gray and cited within Katie King's arguments. In fact, Anne Gray's expanded definition, like others before her, acknowledges the importance, place, and situated experience, which can be cited and used to challenge any truth claims or taken for granted certainties that often marginalise and silent groups of people, and how that gets occupied in feminism. The problem of identity politics that weighed down so much of the 70s and 80s debate is also under scrutiny, as it has been for a long time. There is no demanding adherence to a specific subject position, and Gray's conception of feminism assumes that there is no correct way to practice it. Rather, it acknowledges that different practices can be taken up in the spirit and the cause of feminism, and in the process can be widened to embrace those who may or may not identify with the term, and that's a shift from the histories of ideology. So what questions remain, and what tactics might there be to explore? Okay, here's maybe three. How is labour framed within the craft disciplines? What happens to perceptions of the craftsperson and craft practice when the work is made public and performed rather than remaining private? What of resistance or refusal to make something beautiful or useful? How does an investment in slowness in terms of time and labour shift perceptions of logic and value? Can craft fail to meet its utopian or its political premise in terms of what once was a feminist discourse, or become merely folded back into different kinds or different softer versions of capitalism? How does it stubbornly succeed or find refuge in a refusal to fail? Thank you.